In this presentation, I researched the American Indian Wars, specifically researching the 19th century time period. So my interest developed for this topic while reading The Moon in Two Windows by N. Scott Momaday in class. I wanted to research Plenty Horses as a character and his development as an individual and his involvement in the American Indian Wars after leaving Carlisle. Some background on the American Indian Wars. The initial year that the wars began is disputed by historians. Some historians feel that they began in 1607. Other historians think that it was 1622. The argument for 1607 being the year the wars started is that this was the year that Jamestown was established. Jamestown was the first permanent English settlement to be made. And from 1607 on, they continued to push further in to take more territory so they could create more establishments, and the natives fought them because they wanted to keep their own land. The argument for 1622 being the year that the American Indian Wars began is 1622 was the year that the Jamestown Massacre occurred, which left 347 people dead. And in addition to the Jamestown Massacre, many other settlements were also attacked in a similar manner, just the number of casualties was not as high. These wars took place from the 17th century all the way to the 20th century, ultimately ending in the year 1924. So taking a look at the 19th century. By this time, the engagements had shifted primarily to tribes fighting against U.S. Army forces. Prior to this time, it was just settlers fighting the tribes. Towards the end of the 19th century, some major engagements that took place were the Sand Creek Massacre, the Battle of Little Bighorn, which saw the entire 7th Cavalry Division get wiped out in a single battle, and the Wounded Knee Massacre. The Wounded Knee Massacre took place on December 29th, 1890. Historians dispute whether or not this should be called a battle or a massacre. The argument for this being labeled a battle is that, based on first-hand accounts, a Sioux individual fired the first shots at the U.S. forces, and they were acting in self-defense, so this should be considered a formal exchange of gunfire and an act of war. But the argument that this is a massacre relies heavily on the fact that the Sioux were greatly outnumbered, and there were not a lot of male warriors in the group of Sioux that were surrounded, so historians feel that the Sioux men would not have taken the chance of starting anything with the U.S. forces without having the manpower. And another thing that furthers the argument for this being a massacre is that roughly half of the casualties of the Sioux were women and children. The U.S. forces ultimately lost 25 men and had 39 wounded. So taking a look at Plenty Horses, he spent 5 years at Carlisle, and he left and made it back to his reservation on the day that it was attacked by U.S. forces. Plenty Horses found it difficult to assimilate back into his previous life. The things he learned at Carlisle did not help him, and he felt as though he was not viewed as an actual Lakota individual, but he was also not viewed as a white man. He was almost present among the others. A few days after the Wounded Knee Massacre, Plenty Horses and 3 Lakota men were riding on horseback when they noticed that there was an army officer and 5 Cheyenne scouts also riding on horseback. They ended up coming face to face, and there was some sort of verbal disagreement, which resulted in the U.S. Army officer and the 5 Cheyenne scouts riding off. Plenty Horses then raised his rifle and shot the U.S. Army officer, killing him, which triggered a murder trial. Plenty Horses was acquitted of all charges because the killing of the officer was deemed an act of war. This was mainly deemed an act of war because if it wasn't, that would mean that many killings that took place at the hands of Army officers and Army soldiers would have been considered murder instead of acts of war, which would have resulted in a lot more trials. The quote that I chose from The Moon in Two Windows comes from page 167. The Lakota men watch them. Then Plenty Horses raises a rifle and shoots Casey in the back, killing him instantly. And I chose this quote because it clearly describes the actions that Plenty Horses took and what ended up happening to the officer. These are the sources that I used and where you'd be able to research more on your own about Plenty Horses, the murder trial, Carlisle, and the Lakota.